of the United States Senate. It's the simplest bill we've ever considered here. It says that if a newborn baby survives an abortion, she deserves medical care. That's the bill. That's it. Sadly, a lot of senators are going to come to the floor and they're going to read, or they're planning to read, I hope they reconsider, but they're planning to read talking points that were written for them by Planned Parenthood, and they're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the bill that we actually have before us. Senators are going to muddy the issue, and sadly, too many in the press are going to report with headlines like abortion restrictions and with anti-science jargon like a fetus that was born. That was an actual portion of a headline this morning, a fetus that was born. Sadly, a lot of folks seem determined to look the other way. Looking the other way from the issue that we're considering today in this body shouldn't be an option. So let's start with 4 straight, undeniable facts. 4 simple facts. First, federal law does not criminalize the denial of care to newborn babies that survive abortions. Federal law doesn't criminalize the denial of care to babies that survive abortions. Second, we know that babies sometimes survive abortions, and the data backs that up. If senators don't like this inconvenient fact, they could take it up with the CDC and the states that have mandatory reporting about babies that survive abortions. Third, this bill, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, simply says that if a baby survives an abortion, she should get the same degree of medical care that any other baby would get at that same gestational stage. Really important. Same care that would be provided to any other baby at the same gestational stage. It's a short bill. Baby would get at that same gestation. But all of them could read the bill. So instead of coming to the floor and reciting prepackaged talking points that Planned Parenthood wrote for you, take a few minutes and actually read the bill, and you'll find that your talking points don't match up with the actual bill that you're called to vote on today. Those are the facts. And finally, this is not about abortion. My colleague, the senior senator from South Carolina, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, has a really important piece of legislation that he's going to speak on in a moment, and I'm going to support his legislation. It is a really important pro-life piece of legislation. I'm in favor of it. But my legislation, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, is not actually about abortion. It's about babies that have already survived a botched abortion. My legislation is not about Roe v. Wade. It's about what happens after a baby is already born when an abortion failed to accomplish the purpose it had, the sad purpose in my view, but the purpose it had to terminate that pregnancy. This is about the babies that have already been born. This is about whether that baby who has survived the abortion and is now laying on the abortion table or on the medical table, whether or not that cold, naked baby alone has a right to medical care. And we all know the answer. The answer is, of course she does. Every baby dies if you leave her to passively die of exposure. Whether she was born in a gold-plated hospital with a lot of fancy, expensive cars in the parking lot outside that NICU unit, or whether or not she was born in the unfortunate circumstances of an abortion clinic in a strip mall, every little baby that's already been born, they'll die if you deny care to them. And so, of course, we shouldn't do that. Of course, the United States Senate should stand up and defend those babies. We all know that denying care to the most vulnerable among us is barbaric. And this body ought to be able to stand 100-0 against that barbarism. It's inhumane, and it's passive infanticide, and the Senate should today condemn and prohibit that practice. Is that practice what my colleagues really want to defend? I can't believe that they do. And when you talk to them one-to-one, the 44 who filibustered this legislation a year ago this week, when you talk to them one-to-one, they get real uncomfortable, and they try to change the subject to all sorts of other culture war debates because they don't want to have a conversation about the actual legislation and the actual babies that we're considering today. Why? Because they're scared to death of Planned Parenthood's army of lobbyists. That's why. Not because any of them really want to defend the morally reprehensible, morally indefensible practice that is passive infanticide. None of them want to defend it. They're just scared. Last year, 44 senators filibustered this legislation. They said that it was okay to look the other way while newborns were discarded. They said that federal law should not ensure that these babies are treated with care. They seem to have a real hard time saying that human beings outside the womb have the same right to life as you and I ought to have, and that we get care, we need care, they need care, and they should get care. Put down your talking points. Please read the bill before you vote today. Read the expert testimony that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee allowed us to hold in his committee room 2 weeks ago, where we brought in both medical and legal experts to talk about what happens in these abortion clinics. And so for those in this body who are not on the Judiciary Committee or who didn't do the preparation for today's vote, I want to summarize the testimony of one of the people that came before our Judiciary Committee. Jill Stanek, who now works for the Susan B. Anthony List, was at an Illinois hospital in the 1990s and early 2000s. And here's a quote from her. Of 16 babies that Christ Hospital aborted during the calendar year 2000, 4 that I know of were born alive, and they were aborted alive. That's 25%. 4 out of the 16 abortions at that hospital. Each of those babies, there were 2 boys and there were 2 girls, lived somewhere between 1.5 and 3 hours. One baby was 28 weeks gestation age, 7 months old, and weighed 2 pounds, 7 ounces, close quote. Numbers from the CDC in the states that report data on abortion, that's about 8 of the 50 states that do some reporting and data collection on this. Numbers from the CDC in the states that report data on abortion survivors tell a story of babies who were breathing, whose hearts were beating, who stretched their arms, wiggled their fingers, and kicked their legs. This is the actual data. You want to talk about being pro-science? Being pro-science is pro-baby. What happened to these babies? Medical practitioners have testified before Congress about walking into rooms where living babies were lying naked and alone on countertops, where they would be left to expire by themselves, alone, cold, naked, denied care. Opponents of this bill don't want to deal with the facts. They'd prefer to stick to talking points and claim that this never happens. If they won't listen to the medical experts, perhaps they'll take the word of the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam. In January of last year, disgraced Governor Northam was explicit during a radio interview where he said that a baby born alive during an abortion, quote, would be kept comfortable, then a discussion would ensue, close quote, about whether that baby should be left to die. That's actually what Governor Northam was talking about on the radio in Virginia. What he did is he made the terrible faux pas of saying in public the true stuff that this procedure and this practice of walking away and backing away from these babies and letting them die, he just decided to talk in public about the reality of what happens in some of these abortion clinics. Governor Northam is not an outlier. Just 3 weeks ago, one of the Democratic candidates for president was asked on national television about infanticide, point blank. Would he be comfortable if a mother invoked infanticide to kill her now already born alive child? Mayor Buttigieg's response, quote, I don't know what I'd tell him, close quote. Really? Somebody asks you if you can kill a baby that's already been born and you say you don't know what to say? Every one of us, especially somebody running for the highest office in the land to uphold the laws that promise to protect the right to life, should be able to say without any hesitation, leaving babies to die is unacceptable. This ain't hard stuff, people. There are actually some hard debates we have in this chamber. This isn't one of them. This is about babies that have been born alive and whether or not you can decide to kill them. There's really no debate to be had here, which is why so many people who were planning to speak on the other side decided not to speak this afternoon, because you can't defend the morally reprehensible procedure that is backing away, that is passive infanticide. There are no exceptions. There are no special circumstances. We should protect every human being, no matter how small they are, no matter how weak they are. And if the Senate says that it's okay to ignore born-alive babies, what we're really saying is we are okay with a society where some people count more than other people. We'd be saying that we want a society where some people can be pushed aside if other people decide those folks are inconvenient. A society where we can dispose of you if you happen to come in the world a certain way. It's unbelievably telling that Planned Parenthood, NARAL, which is the extremist abortion lobby, and their armies of lawyers and slick public relations teams and influence peddlers cannot draw this line. It's pretty amazing. This bill is not about abortion. Again, I want to be clear, we're voting on two things today. One of them is a piece of legislation about abortion. It's the pain-capable bill. Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, is going to speak in favor of it in a minute, and I'm an original co-sponsor of his legislation. I support it, and I'm going to wholeheartedly vote for it. But the other piece of legislation we're going to vote on today isn't actually even about abortion. This should be a 100-0 no-brainer. This bill is not about Roe v. Wade. This bill will not change one word of abortion law in the United States, and my colleagues can vote up or down, but they can't pretend that they don't know the stakes of what we're talking about. America is a country built on the beautiful principle of equality, and the terms of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act are intended to reflect that. A child born alive during a botched abortion should be given the same level of care that would be provided to any other baby born at that same gestational stage, which is just to say, a born alive baby is a human being with fundamental human dignity, which is undeniable. She should receive the care and affection due to every other human being. And today, we have a chance to advance our commitment to human dignity. We can protect those babies who come into the world under the worst of conditions. We can welcome them into a world with love and hope and help and care. My colleagues, please do not turn your backs on those babies. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. Before Senator Sass leaves, I just can't thank you enough for the passion and the persuasion you bring to these issues. You speak from the heart, you speak with reason, you make a lot of sense, and over time you will prevail. Just stick with it. Your day will come. And what he's saying is if you try to abort a child and the child survives the abortion, shouldn't the doctor and the nurses and everybody involved treat the child the same as if it happened, they came into the world some other way? I think the answer is yes. I mean, really, these two pieces of legislation are about us as a nation. This is, 2020. Who are we as Americans? It's odd to me that we even need to have a discussion about this. I'm just perplexed that this is even a problem. Abortion is legal in the United States. So there are certain restrictions on it, but I just can't believe we can't rally around the idea if the baby survives the procedure and is alive and breathing and functioning, that medical science doesn't kick in to save the baby. It's just, I don't know. I don't know what happened. What happened to our country that we even talking about this? It's 2020, for God's sakes. It's not 1020. And anyway, just hang in there, Ben. Your day will come. So my legislation is... been doing this for a few years now, that we're one of 7 nations in the world that allows abortion on demand at 20 weeks. North Korea, Vietnam, China, Singapore, the Netherlands, and Canada. So what would this legislation do? At 20 weeks, this is about the 5th month in the birthing process. It's called the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. Now, why do we call it that? Medical science has determined that a child at 20 weeks is capable of feeling excruciating pain. So if there's an operation to save a child's life or to repair a medical defect at 20 weeks, they provide anesthesia to the child because during the surgery, the child feels pain. And you can see when a child's poked, they actually repel against the poking. The bottom line is I find it odd that medical science requires anesthesia to save the baby's life, but during that same period, you can dismember the child. And that's what we're talking about here. What kind of nation are we? At the 5th month, now this is 20 weeks into the birthing process, we're one of 7 nations that allow abortion on demand. There's exceptions for the life of the mother, that hard decision. If the mother's life is impacted by the child, then we'll leave that up to the family. The pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. But beyond that, we want to eliminate abortion on demand at the 20-week period because I would argue that doesn't make us a better nation. It doesn't advance anybody's cause. The bottom line is we know, based on medical science, that this child has nerve endings intact. Medical encyclopedias encourage young parents to sing to their unborn child during this period of development because they can begin to associate your voice and recognize who you are. I find it odd that we would encourage young parents to sing to their unborn child at 20 weeks. We require anesthesia to save the child's life, but we're also a country that allows the child to be dismembered. Makes like no sense to me. They've got exceptions that make sense, life of the mother, result of rape or incest where there was no choice at all. The bottom line is that these two pieces of legislation are going to continue to be advanced until they pass. It takes a while for America to kind of get focused on what we're saying here because abortion is an uncomfortable topic to talk about, particularly at the early stages of the pregnancy. But what Senator Sass is saying, in the case of the child surviving an abortion, there's really not much to talk about. We should protect the life that is now in being. The baby survived. I don't know why the baby survived. I don't know how the baby survived. I just know that decent people would want to come to the child's aid once you do survive. And just imagine for an hour and a half what it must be like for the baby to have survived the abortion to be left unattended for an hour and a half to 3 hours. That says a lot about us as a nation. Now, I just think we're better than that. It's kind of odd that we even have to have this debate, but apparently we do, because this happens more than you would ever think. That babies actually survive abortion. And the rules in this country are that you just let it die. It's no longer required care. That to me is, as Senator Sass said, barbaric. It doesn't make us a better people, and it really doesn't affect the abortion debate because the baby survived. Now, my legislation is about us as a nation too. How does abortion on demand in the 5th month advance the cause of America? I don't think it does. We have exceptions in those instances where it's a tragic choice between the life of the mother and the unborn child, and in cases of rape or incest, which are tragic and criminal. But generally speaking, we would like to get ourselves out of a club of 7 nations that allow abortion on demand at a time when the parents are encouraged to sing to the child, and you have to provide anesthesia to save the child's life because you wouldn't want to operate on a baby in a fashion to hurt the child. I dare say that if you're a doctor and you try to save a baby's life at 20 weeks through surgery and you don't provide anesthesia, you're going to wind up getting yourself in trouble. I find it odd that the law would allow the dismemberment of the child, even with anesthesia. But that is where we are. And to Senator Sass, your articulate spokesman for your legislation, one day we'll prevail. It took 15 years to pass the late-term abortion ban. It's going to take a while, but our day will come. And at the end of the day, the sooner America can get this right, the better off we'll be. With that, I yield.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 420 S3275, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to protect pain-capable unborn children and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S 3275, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to protect pain-capable unborn children and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blunt, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Graham, Hawley, Loeffler, Manchin, Roberts, Sass, and Scott of Florida. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Hirono, Merkley, Schumer, Sinema, and Whitehouse. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo, ah. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cassidy, ah. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, ah. Mr. Purdue, Mr. Purdue, ah. Mrs. Shaheen, Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe, ah. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Hassan, Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Thune, Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown? No. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? No. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner? Aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich? No. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Booker? Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Braun? Mr. Braun? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Mr. Cardin? No. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford? Aye. Mr. Portman? Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones? No. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall? No. Mr. Tester? Mr. Tester? No. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? Aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith? No. Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tillis? Aye. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz? No. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? No. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? No. Ms. Ernst, Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Baldwin, Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Alexander, Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio, aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Harris, no. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Brasso, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 44. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. Senator from Florida.
That the remaining votes in this series be 10 minutes in length.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 17 S311, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a healthcare practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or an attempted abortion, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S311, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a healthcare practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or attempted abortion shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Hoeven, Johnson, Jones, Kennedy, Loeffler, Manchin, Paul, Portman, Risch, Sass, Scott of Florida, Shelby, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Hirono, Menendez, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Schumer, Sinema, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, and Wyden. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Smith, Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Burr, Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Romney, Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Carper, Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Udall, Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Markey, Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Purdue, Mr. Purdue, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Moran, Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Ms. Harris, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye.
Is there any senator in the chamber who wishes to vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the ayes are 56, the nays are 41. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate shall resume executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk shall report.
Nomination, the judiciary, Sylvia Corina Cole of Puerto Rico to be United States District Judge for the District of Puerto Rico.
The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second?
There appears to be.
There appears to be.